Chapter 8. The Golden Bough docked early in the morning of Sunday, November the 9th, 1896. Within minutes, the London dockers had secured her to the quay and gangplanks were lowered. Soon after that, the ship was a scurry of activity as packing cases and crates were hoisted ashore. Atkins supervised the unloading, just as he had ensured that everything was properly stowed before setting out from Egypt 7 weeks earlier. He stood on the dockside, notebook in hand, checking off each item as it was brought ashore. Then each was packed into one of the waiting carriages, depending on its destination. "You seem to be having fun," the doctor said as he joined Atkins. His breath was smoky in the cold morning air. "Change in weather is always a problem when travelling, I find." "Indeed, Doctor." Atkins checked the stencilled letters on the side of a crate as it was carried past by 2 stevedores. He pointed the dockers to the nearest of the carriages. The doctor continued, as he watched the crate's bobbing progress towards the nearest carriage. "And talking of problems..." Part of the time on the journey back had been spent allocating the various relics to museums and members of the expedition. The British Museum took the lion's share, of course. Kenilworth kept several items, like the ring found on the shelf by the sarcophagus, for his private collection. He also kept, at the doctor's insistence and to the evident disappointment of Evans, the mummy itself. They compromised by sending the lid of the casket to the museum. Evans himself elected to keep only a few of the smaller pieces he was offered, including the scarab bracelet found in the burial chamber. The cobra statuette found with it went to Macready, together with several papyrus scrolls. Atkins had repacked everything, with help from the others, principally Miss Tegan. He had found he grew to enjoy the time spent going through the inventory with her. Despite her attempts at small talk and her distracting manner, Tegan was pleasant company and performed her allotted tasks with a speed and efficiency which belied her manner. Atkins found himself looking forward to the sessions in a similar way to his anticipation of the evening planning meeting with Miss Warne back at Kenilworth House. And with this observation came the realization that he was missing the meetings with Miss Warne. Indeed, he was missing her company generally. So, it was with a feeling of deep disappointment which he could not possibly voice or allow others to discern that Atkins received the doctor's words. "I'm afraid I'll have to ask you to stay in the TARDIS for a day or two." He slapped Atkins on the shoulder. "You see, there are 2 of you here at the moment. Once your other self has left with us for ancient Egypt, then you can return to Kenilworth House and carry on as usual. But until then..." The doctor grinned as Atkins concentrated on his notes. "It's all a bit complicated. I'm not sure that I actually understand it too well myself, now I come to think about it." Atkins said nothing for a while. The doctor looked over his shoulder at the notebook and frowned as he tried to decipher the handwriting. "Is the TARDIS ashore yet, by the way?" Atkins indicated a nearby warehouse with the end of his pencil. "The harbour master says it can stay there till Wednesday free of charge." The doctor nodded. "More than generous," he said, "and more than long enough." He patted Atkins on the shoulder again. "I hope you don't mind, but it is rather important." Atkins did not look up. "You know best, Doctor," he said quietly. Having installed Atkins in the TARDIS and provided him with an adequate pile of reading material, it turned out he was a devotee of Dickens, the Doctor and Tegan took their leave of the expedition members. Macready and Kenilworth were off to Kenilworth House, and the Doctor agreed that he and Tegan would meet them there that afternoon. Evans was keen to return to the British Museum and start right away on unpacking the relics returned from Egypt. He hoped to have some of them at least on display in the Egyptian room by the evening. The only disappointment in his enthusiasm seemed to be that this time neither his daughter nor Simmons would help him update the catalogues. "So what do we do now?" Tegan asked the Doctor. The Doctor consulted his watch, turned a full circle on his heel, and grinned. "How about some shopping?" he suggested. "It's nearly 10 o'clock, and Harrods has been open for 47 years. Should have stocked up on something other than groceries by now. And Nissa? The doctor breathed out heavily, his breath hanging in the air amongst the other pollutants. Nissa will be perfectly safe until tomorrow when we unwrap her. We managed to keep the casket level during the journey, which was the main thing. Now, I think we should let Kenilworth get back to his house and his wife and have some peace and quiet for a few hours. We'll see him this afternoon. The doctor stepped out into the road and waved at an approaching cab. Think it might snow later, he said as the cabby guided his horse to the curb. You know it will, Tegan said as she climbed in ahead of the doctor. They spent the morning at Harrods and looked in some of the other shops on the Brompton Road. Then they had a light lunch at Bond's tea shop before taking rooms at the Savoy. The doctor signed the hotel register at 3:27. Kenilworth ordered afternoon tea for the drawing room. I thought we could discuss where the sarcophagus should be set up with the doctor and Miss Tegan, he told Atkins. Indeed, sir. And will the doctor and Miss Tegan be taking tea also? Kenilworth laughed. When did you ever know the doctor to refuse a cup of tea? The doctor, sir? Atkins cocked his head slightly to one side. I'm not sure that I'm acquainted with the gentleman. Kenilworth stared in amazement for a moment. Not sure that... He looked from Atkins to his wife and back. Good grief, man. You'll be telling us you don't remember Miss Tegan either next? He smiled and gave a sharp nod to emphasize his point. Who, sir? Atkins asked innocently. Kenilworth opened his mouth, then closed it again. Perhaps Atkins was joking, yet he seemed entirely sincere. You're right, Atkins, Kenilworth asked. Come to think of it, you do look a bit pale. I'm in excellent health, thank you, sir. Lady Kenilworth leaned forward in her chair. That's all right, Atkins. Just arrange the tea, would you? Indeed, ma'am, Atkins said with evident relief, taking his leave. Kenilworth shook his head as Atkins left the room. I don't know, he said. Leave him alone, dear, Lady Kenilworth said quietly. He's been a perfect treasure while you've been away, as always. Kenilworth was not listening. Maybe it's a change in climate. He wasn't like this in Egypt. Lady Kenilworth smiled. But that was years ago, she said, when you were both younger. Oh, no, I mean this trip. The last few months. Lady Kenilworth frowned. I don't think I follow. All I'm saying is that he was fine, his usual calm, efficient self. And we had some dicey moments, I don't mind telling you. Lady Kenilworth stood up and crossed to where her husband was sitting. She rested her hand on his shoulder. But he's been here, she said, with me. Atkins never went to Egypt. In the distance, the doorbell rang. Kenilworth barely heard it. What are you talking about? He asked his wife. I left him here with you, yes, but Atkins joined us in Cairo at the beginning of September. He must have left here 4 months ago. Lady Kenilworth did not reply immediately. She sat down again and looked out of the window. The sound of several sets of footsteps drifted in from the hallway, getting steadily closer. Well, she said at last, all I can say is that I had not noticed he was gone. And neither, I suspect, have any of the other servants. Kenilworth snorted and shook his head. Perhaps you should ask Miss Warne, his wife suggested. I'm sure she will be able to tell you the whereabouts of Mr. Atkins for the past year or more, let alone the past few weeks. Kenilworth was about to ask his wife what she meant, but at that moment the door opened and Atkins entered. The doctor and Miss Tegan Jovanka, he announced. Then he stepped aside to allow the doctor and Tegan to enter. Ah, Doctor, Miss Tegan. Kenilworth was across the room and shaking hands enthusiastically before the doctor and Tegan were properly through the door. He introduced them to his wife and waved them to chairs. Atkins watched the proceedings, then, when he discerned that he was no longer needed, left the room, quietly closing the door behind him. "Perhaps you can help settle a small disagreement, Doctor," Kenilworth said. Tea had been brought in, and they were sitting with bone china cups and cucumber sandwiches. "Ah," the doctor said awkwardly, replacing his cup on its saucer and looking carefully into it as if trying to decode the pattern of the tea leaves. "It's about Atkins." The doctor looked up. He did not look happy. "Yes, I was rather afraid it might be." He exchanged a pained glance with Tegan. "Look, can I ask you a small favour?" "Of course." "Please don't worry yourselves with where Atkins has been or hasn't been. I'm sure he'll remember everything soon enough, and if you need an explanation, then he can probably provide it." The doctor gulped down the remains of his tea, draining the cup. Then he grimaced. "I must be getting used to tea bags," he said. "Abominations." "I thought perhaps," Kenilworth said as the tea things were cleared away, "we should have the unwrapping in here." "Sounds good to me," Tegan said. "Excellent, capital." The doorbell clanged in the distance, and Kenilworth consulted his pocket watch. "I've asked Professor Macready to join us this afternoon to help set up the sarcophagus. That'll be him now." The doctor stood up and walked across the room, hands in trouser pockets. "Were you intending to set up the casket about here?" he asked as he reached the far corner. Kenilworth laughed. "I told you," he said to his wife. "Never ceases to amaze. He even knows what I'm thinking now." The doctor joined in the laughter. "Hardly." "Good. Then you won't know that I've got some invitations printed up already. Should be delivered this evening. I'll drop one round to the Savoy for you so you can see it if you like." "Professor Macready," announced, ushering in the small professor. Macready peered across the room at them, polishing his spectacles furiously on a handkerchief. When he was done, he popped his glasses back on his nose and beamed at Kenilworth. "Good to see you again, old man." He looked round the room, the light shining off his glasses as he tried to find the sarcophagus. "It's in the dining room at the moment," Lady Kenilworth told him, "which I must say is extremely inconvenient. Perhaps you gentlemen could ask Atkins to help you bring it in here instead." The sarcophagus was unwieldy rather than heavy, and with the added challenge of keeping it level, at the doctor's insistence, it took the four of them several minutes to manoeuvre the coffin the short distance from the dining room to the drawing room. The effort seemed not to bother the doctor, though Macready, by contrast, slumped into an armchair and dabbed at his forehead. "Goodness me," he said, "so much exercise." He stuffed his handkerchief back into his pocket and leaped to his feet again. "Magnificent," he said. "Quite magnificent. Tell me, Doctor, have you yet formulated any opinions you are willing to share on the history or age of this piece?" Tegan laughed. "I'll say," she started. But the doctor gestured for her to be quiet. "I think we should reserve our opinions for the unwrapping, Professor." "Indeed, indeed." Macready stroked his finger along the rim of the sarcophagus. "I still find it quite astounding. This must be 3,000 years old at least." The doctor nodded. "I'd put it at a bit older than that," he said. "Another 1,000 years, perhaps?" 4,000? Really?" Macready nodded slowly as he considered. "We shall see," he muttered. "We shall see." The doctor yawned and stretched. "Well," he said to Tegan, "I think it's time we were making a move. A brisk walk, followed by a bite to eat." "Don't let us keep you, Doctor." Kenilworth shook their hands again. "Macready and I have lots to talk about, and we'll see you for the unrolling tomorrow." He saw them to the door. "I'll have Atkins drop round an invitation as soon as they arrive," he said, as they entered the hallway. "Ah," the doctor said. "Perhaps another small favour." Kenilworth laughed. "What inscrutable request is it this time?" "Could you perhaps ask Atkins to deliver the invitation to us outside the British Museum." "The British Museum," Kenilworth echoed, as much as anything to check he had heard correctly. Yes, outside the north door, at exactly midnight." "Midnight." The doctor smiled broadly. "You've got it." He took Kenilworth's hand and shook it enthusiastically. "Thank you so much," he said. "You've been very understanding." "Not at all, Doctor. Not at all." Kenilworth opened the front door. Tegan shook Kenilworth's hand as she followed the doctor out. "He's right," she said. "For a change. You've been great. Thanks." Kenilworth watched the two figures make their way down the drive. It was already dark, and a light sprinkling of snow was settling on the ground. It was strange, Lord Kenilworth reflected, as he closed the front door. The doctor and Tegan had both behaved as if they were bidding him farewell for the last time. Yet they would see each other again tomorrow afternoon. They arrived back at the Savoy at just after 9. The doctor suggested he call for Tegan at 10 for a late dinner. "I've got a few things I want to think through," he told her. "An hour should be ample." Tegan was happy to have a few minutes to herself. Several parcels had been delivered from Harrods, the fruits of her shopping expedition that morning. Not noted for her patience, Tegan was keen to unpack them right away. She waved to the doctor as he unlocked the door to his room, but he seemed not to notice. She could see that he was already deep in thought. He pulled a battered notebook from his jacket pocket and went into his room. By 10:30, Tegan was fed up with waiting. She paused for the briefest of moments outside the door to the doctor's room, then knocked. There was no answer, so she opened it and went in. The doctor was lying on the bed, hands clasped behind his head, staring at the ceiling. His notebook was still open, but laid face down on his chest. "Ah, Tegan," he said without moving. "Do come in." "You're late," she said, "and I'm hungry." "Dinner!" The doctor heaved himself off the bed. "Oh, yes." The notebook fell to the floor and he picked it up. "Any new clues?" Tegan asked as she followed the doctor from the room. He said. "I'll tell you after we've eaten." "Don't want to spoil my appetite," she joked. The doctor glared at her, then set off down the corridor without answering. The dining room was almost empty. An old man sat on his own at a table near the door. A middle-aged couple occupied a booth in the far corner. The old man eyed the doctor and Tegan suspiciously as they waited to be seated. The doctor smiled at him, and Tegan frowned. "Colonel Finkelstone," the man barked suddenly, wiping his mouth on his napkin. "Don't have the salmon." The waiter scowled at the man as he arrived to attend to the doctor and Tegan. Thank you," the doctor replied. "The doctor and Miss Tegan Jovanka." Colonel Finkelstone snorted as if they had in some way insulted him, and returned his attention to his wine. "Doctor, Miss Jovanka," the waiter smiled widely and nodded to them, picking up on their names. "Dinner for two?" "Please," the doctor replied. "Table near the window, perhaps." "Of course, sir." The waiter led them across the near-deserted room. "Will all this do?" he asked as they reached the table where they had eaten breakfast what seemed like several months previously. "Admirably, thank you." The doctor seated himself and accepted a menu and wine list. The waiter pulled back Tegan's chair for her as she sat down. "Oh, no, you don't," Tegan said before he could push the chair in again, dragging it in closer to the table. The waiter left them to look at the menu. Tegan flicked through, remembering the brief conversation they had exchanged before. "I believe I'll have the oysters," the doctor said, laying his menu to one side and picking up the wine list. It was leather-bound, with a gold cord down the spine ending in a tassel. "You know you will," Tegan said. "Yes, but you have to go through the motions." "Why?" Tegan dropped her menu heavily on the table by her plate. It clattered against the lead crystal and disturbed the double damask. "You keep going on about how we can't change things, but you won't prove it." I don't need to. I know. Tegan looked out of the window. The moon was shining through the murky night, its light diffused across the surface of the Thames outside. Snow was falling lazily through the smog, spiralling its way through the young trees which edged the embankment. "Doctor," Tegan said quietly, "in about an hour we will arrive at the British Museum. What's to stop us, this us, going there and warning us, that us, to leave before anything happens to Nissa?" The doctor said nothing for a while. He stared out of the window, or perhaps he was watching Tegan's reflection in the glass as she continued to watch the snow. "You see those snowflakes?" he said at last. Tegan nodded. "As they twist and tumble their way down, they collide with each other, get swept away in the breeze, melt in a warm updraft. Now, imagine you plotted the course of one of those snowflakes, and you found that it collided with another snowflake, and you found that it collided with it not just once, but twice. So? And then you changed the course of one of the snowflakes so that the first collision never happened. Yes, so what? So, would the second collision happen?" Tegan considered. "Maybe. You can't tell." The doctor nodded. "That's right. As soon as you change any of the circumstances, all bets are off. The second collision may occur, or it may not. There may be a completely different collision, or the snowflake may melt on a gas lamp before it reached its rendezvous." "What's that got to do with Nissa?" The doctor beckoned to the waiter, who was standing on the far side of the room. "Everything," he said. "If we change things, we have no idea what will happen as a result, what collisions we set up, what courses we alter. We might all end up mummified, and that would help nobody. Maybe we should try, but that's not the way time works. You only get one chance." He leaned forward and looked deep into Tegan's eyes. "We couldn't change a thing. We could go to the museum, but we'd be delayed on the way or miss ourselves somehow, which is probably as well, given what would happen to the temporal differential if we actually did meet." "How do you know you can't change it? You won't try." Tegan's frustration was cut short by the arrival of the waiter. "Oysters," the doctor said immediately, "and a bottle of the Morgan." Tegan had not decided, though she knew what she would not be having. She grabbed back her menu as the waiter lifted it from the table, opened it, and went for the first thing she saw. Ham. The waiter was still startled. He blinked, then realised that Tegan had ordered. "Very good," he said, bowed, and left. "Not having the cutlets?" the doctor asked, as soon as the waiter was out of earshot. "Didn't fancy them." "And I thought you were making a point." The doctor turned his attention back to the snow outside. "It's a shame you don't fancy the cutlets, though," he said quietly, "since you'll have to eat them." Tegan forced herself to keep relatively calm. "How do you know?" she asked, one hand clenching on the edge of the tablecloth. "Look, Tegan." The doctor cleared aside his cutlery and rested his hands on the table as he leaned forward. "You want to go and warn ourselves at the British Museum to leave at once." "Yes." "And what do you think will happen if we do that?" "We'll leave," Tegan said. "We'll go back into the TARDIS and this will be all right." The doctor nodded. "And if we had done that, which we didn't, then who will warn us?" "What?" "Look," the doctor said, pressing his hands together and raising them so that his index fingers almost touched his lips. "If we had left straight after we arrived, either through some warning or on a whim, we would not be here now. So we could not be having this discussion, coming to a conclusion, or rushing to warn ourselves. The fact that we are here now means that we didn't, will not, leave." Tegan frowned. "So we can't change anything?" "Well, I have seen it done, but never without immense initial cost, and always so that history returns to its original track as soon as it gets the chance." The doctor leaned back in his seat as the waiter approached again. "You needn't take my word for it, though." The doctor tasted the wine, swilling it noisily round his mouth and smacking his lips together appreciatively. He nodded his approval, and the waiter sloshed some wine into Tegan's glass, then carefully poured for the doctor. "Charming," Tegan said as he left. The doctor smiled. "An example of what we were just discussing, surely?" "How so?" "Why were you rude to him when we arrived just now?" "Because he was so snotty last time." The doctor nodded. "But for him, last time hasn't happened yet. Though when it does, at breakfast tomorrow, he'll be snotty to you. And he'll be snotty to you because you were rude to him the night before. Which, for me, won't have happened yet." "Exactly." The doctor sipped at his wine. "This is rather good, you know. It's a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy." "I'll be nice to him then," Tegan said. "Well, here's your chance." The doctor nodded to the waiter as he approached again, this time pushing a low trolley. "Good luck." Tegan smiled sweetly at the waiter as he removed the silver lid from the platter he presented to the doctor. He did his best to ignore her. "Oysters, sir." Tegan continued to smile as he produced her dinner, trying to make meaningful eye contact as he set it before her. "Cutlets, madame," he said. Tegan's smile froze. "What?" "Cutlets. You asked for lamb." "My compliments to the chef," the doctor slipped in quietly. "These oysters are magnificent." Then Tegan exploded. "We need to pack," the doctor said as they made their way up the stairs back to their rooms. "Oh, why?" "Two reasons. First, the rooms will be needed later tonight. By us, I remember. And second, before dinner, I managed to decipher some of the hieroglyphics I copied down from the tomb." They paused outside Tegan's room. "And what does that mean?" she asked. "I think it means that reviving Nissa, starting irreversibly the 100-year cycle to bring her back to life, was one of my less inspired actions." "I meant to ask you," Tegan said after a moment's pause, "why 100 years, apart from the fact it's a good round figure?" "I've been asking myself that." And it just popped into my head, which is at least part of the problem. And now the stars are setting their courses, and so we have to be there when she wakes. I'll see you in 5 minutes. As she gathered together her belongings, Tegan was in an ambivalent mood. The doctor's comments had worried her, but they were off to a time which was rather closer to her own, and where she would be reunited with Nissa. She wondered what Atkins would make of the late 20th century. She had understood enough to realise he would have to come with them until they could return him to the time after he had first left with them. Perhaps the doctor was right after all about the way that time crystallised like a snowflake around your actions and despite your intentions. Whether she tried to trick her way out of it, or to go with the flow, events seemed set in their preordained courses. Before she left, Tegan carefully laid out the pale green dress she had bought in Harrods that morning. Egypt, January 1897. The three mummies stood, forming a perfect triangle in front of the position where the sarcophagus had rested. They had remained there, static, for the last few months, guarding the statue of Anubis while their masters had been to London and back. In front of them, Simmons bowed to the jackal statue with reverence and respect. "Will just the one relic remain sufficient?" Rasul asked. Simmons nodded. "The energy you will need for the next century is not great. And when the time comes, the power will build as you need it. Orion will come into configuration, and the signal strength will increase accordingly." Simmons pressed the central square of the Nephthys cartouche, and the heavy door to the inner chamber swung open. Rasul moved aside to let the mummies file through into the room beyond. As the third of the service robots passed through, the door swung shut behind it.
"They will return to their charge points until you need them."
"Until I need them?" asked Rasul. "Surely you—" But Simmons was shaking his head.
"This body is already decaying, and the journey to the damper climate of England has not helped. The powers granted to you are more durable. You have waited this long, and now you begin the final stage of your journey. Another century is as nothing to you."
Simmons turned back to the engraved symbol of Nethsis's name.
"For me—"
Simmons's last words were a crackled gasp. Rasul was not sure if he had actually said, "for me," or "free." But before he could decide, Simmons slowly crumpled to his knees, the bones in his legs cracking as they splintered and fractured. He pitched forwards, face smashing into the wall of the tomb. His head cracked open, dry powder cascading out and falling to the floor like sand in an hourglass. As Rasul watched, Simmons's body slowly crumbled away until only a fine dust remained. A sudden, impossible breeze cleaned it from the stone floor and sent it scurrying into the corners of the tomb. Rasul waited for a while. Simmons was right. He had waited a long time. And soon it would be over. Just a few short decades, and he too would be free. The Valley of the Kings, Ancient Egypt, circa 5000 BC. The rain was still falling heavily as the gods made their way into the pyramid. The rain cascaded down the smooth white slopes of the sides and waterfalled over the entrance. A blast of lightning split the black sky, making the pyramid seem to glow. Rasul looked away as the glare hurt his eyes. The gods made their ponderous way inside, their work complete. Horus and Anubis were last into the structure, Isis just ahead of them. Once across the threshold, Horus turned and looked back at the assembled priests. His face was just visible through the falling water as he nodded slowly in approval. As Rasul watched, Horus raised his arms, made the sign of the eye. Then he stepped back into the pyramid, out of sight in the darkness within. The next moment, without apparent change in the pyramid's form or shape, the water was no longer falling from the edge of the doorframe, but continuing its cascade down the smooth, unbroken side. The lightning flashed again, and when Rasul blinked away the brightness and looked back, the pyramid was gone. The rain slowed, picking random holes in the dry square of sand.